Welcome to the Oxbow Gallery. So glad you could all be here. Before we begin our talk this evening, we have a few members of our business community we need to thank for their support. Florence Savings Bank, this is their second year supporting our talks. Our neighbors at Northampton Coffee, right next door. Collective Copies, a worker-owned print shop in Florence. They did all our posters. Pivot Media, also based in Florence. High-quality digital reproductions for all you artists out there. And the Guild Art Supply. Okay, our guest this evening is Bill Tucker, and Mr. Tucker was born in Egypt, but raised in England. He attended Oxford University, where he studied history. He went on to St. Martin's College of Art and Design, and it was there in 1860 where he and some other young sculptors made a radical break with tradition through creating abstract sculptures using industrial materials that were placed directly on the ground. Said literally took sculpture off its pedestal. Mr. Tucker represented England in the 1972 Venice Biennale, and in 1974 he wrote The Language of Sculpture, a book whose words he says he still stands by today. Mr. Tucker's taught at various universities and colleges throughout the UK and the United States, and in 1985 he became an American citizen. He was represented at Storm King Art Center in 1987. In 2010, Mr. Tucker was a recipient of the International Sculpture Center's Lifetime Achievement in Contemporary Sculpture Award. Mr. Tucker lives and works in Ashfield, and when I told one of the Oxbow Gallery's original members that Bill Tucker was giving a talk here, he said, "Oh, I heard Bill give a talk at Chautauqua 20 years ago, and I'm still thinking about what he said to this day." So, no pressure. And we're so glad to have you here, and thank you for saying yes to this evening.
I thought I would start by showing an image of the sculpture on the poster, just to acquaint you, if you don't know my work, with what I've been doing in the last 2 or 3 years. Then I want to go back and talk about what I was doing earlier. And my reason for doing that is not long ago I read a book by a woman called Susan Barry, who teaches at Mount Holyoke, called Holding My Gaze, or something like that. I forget the exact title. You may have heard about it. She was born basically cross-eyed and had corrective surgery when she was really an infant or very young. And they straightened out her eyes, but she could never see three-dimensionally. She would see with one eye and then the other. And the book is really a description of how she regained three-dimensional vision in her 40s or 50s. And she explains the kind of, with the help of a local optometrist called Teresa Ruggiero, has an office in Northampton. Dr. Ruggiero has developed an incredible process of training people's eyes so they can, she feels that a lot of people's problems with learning, reading, comprehension are to do with the fact that their eyes are not focusing properly, and they can be trained to do that. Susan Barry's cure was the result of a lot of hard work, but it was deemed to be pretty well miraculous. This doesn't happen to most people. She describes how she got back her three-dimensional vision and how miraculous that seemed to her. Just getting into her car and suddenly the steering wheel kind of popped out, or she is in a snowstorm and sees the individual snowflakes kind of separated in space. And so this book made me think about, in a way, what the purpose of sculpture is. For from my point of view, one of the purposes, which is it's to do with seeing three-dimensionally and experiencing three-dimensionally, and kind of opening up that experience for the viewer, not only looking at the sculpture itself, but also in everyday life. And if you just like take a walk through the woods, say, and you could, I mean, I do this now, kind of very consciously, having read that book, just really kind of having a sense of the fullness of the volumes of the trunks of trees, and of the kind of reality of the spaces between them. This is an image of a sculpture that's now on loan to the de Cordova, and it's called Chinese Horse, and it actually depicts a horse's head reversed with the nose down to the ground. This is a sculpture that I'm working on right now. Well, I think I pretty well finished it, and this picture was taken, I think, in February, which is kind of just, we're sort of looking down at it. It's really pretty big. And this is the most recent one of a series of horses' heads that happened kind of more or less accidentally initially in the middle 1980s. And so over the years, they've been, I think, becoming more explicit about what they're about. And it seems to me a great, it's a great motif for saying something kind of literal about the image, the horse's head, but also presenting a kind of a whole number of readings that could be, that you could also see it as. So it isn't that literal. When I started making sculpture in the late 50s, I was studying history at Oxford and going to an art school that was kind of attached to the university. And there at the time were a bunch of American GIs who were studying in Europe on the GI Bill after the Korean War. And this school was one of the few places where they were at that time. And actually, John Updike was not a GI. He was not on the GI Bill, but he was there. And I made good friends with those people and was really impressed by their dedication to being an artist. They were the first real artists that I'd met. And I became really interested in what was going on in contemporary art, and started to go up and see exhibitions in London, and saw great exhibitions of American abstract expressionist paintings that were kind of touring Europe at the time, and was really very much excited by those. And started to make sculpture after visiting an exhibition in one of the parks in London, where there was a show which featured Henry Moore and a number of the younger British sculptors around him. And I was really impressed by Moore's piece in that show, and kind of decided there and then that was what I wanted to do. So this actually dates from, I think, about 62. And by this time, I'd kind of I was reacting very much against Moore and to the artists who were influenced by him, and trying to get away from the figure and the rather kind of rhetorical expressionism that those figures had, and wanted to really get down to kind of sculpture as an object, not as a figure. One of the earliest groups of pieces I made of this kind basically drew out the kind of profile of a piece on a chalkboard, and then modeled, like in this case, modeled the left-hand side fully from that profile in plaster, and the right-hand side is cut out of steel. Here's another piece with the same kind of. So, you know, it's interesting to me now that they were what I thought was severely abstract at the time, are full of figurative illusions. But, you know, even with these pieces, they're kind of like parts of figures, and they surprisingly kind of really connect with what I've been doing in the last 20 years. But I went through, you know, a period of kind of a much more linear kind of abstraction in using mostly steel, also occasionally wood. And this also has a kind of, this dates from kind of early 70s. Here's another view of it. So you can see it changes radically according to where you're looking at it. And this piece was like a problem piece in that I wanted to make something that would appear to be, that in fact would be like made of an endless loop of, or not an endless loop, but just one single piece of steel pipe bent with a hydraulic tube bender that I had at the time, so that it has a kind of sensuous quality too, in that when you use this tube bender, you have to bend the pipe like every kind of couple of inches at least, so that the whole thing is like being kind of shaped with a giant hand. Now, in the kind of early 70s, middle 70s, I felt that my work was kind of getting too, I suppose, too kind of all the way around, too kind of spatial, and didn't have a kind of presence that would actually address itself to the spectator. So this particular piece is made of the steel tube I was working with at the time, square and round tube. But I decided to make something like this. I'll show you a number of slides of it so you can see what it's like from different views. And my idea was to add these bars to it to each of the main members, and they're all they're equally spaced and they're parallel. And the effect is that it's very hard to feel that this right triangle is actually, when you see it, that it actually joins at the corners, because the effect of the steel bars is to make it rack or twist visually. I called it Angel. It's a sort of play on angle. So very much at this, what really happened was a real concern with perception and what happens with visual perception, because none of the sculpture that I was making at this time, and for the previous 10 years really, during the 1960s, none of it kind of invited a sense of touch at all. It kind of stood on the ground and kind of stood perhaps in the place where another person would be standing. So it's occupying a kind of human space, but it's much more like an industrial fabricated object than it is than something that is actually shaped by the human hand. So these pieces, this is actually one of the first pieces. Angel I made in the UK, and I moved over here in the kind of middle 70s. And this is one of the first pieces that I made. Instead of these bars, I kind of notched the outline of this piece, but it's still, if you see it from the side, it's absolutely, exists in a single plane, and as a silhouette. And the way it's articulated is meant in the same kind of way to both to frame whatever's behind it, and it also kind of frames the space of a standing person. And the bent side of it suggests the geometric shape that it's made of is kind of feels as though it's starting to collapse. And someone pointed out to me at the time that I was rather dismissive of it, that it also kind of implies the stance of a kind of the classical human, male figure standing, like from classical sculpture, the kind of contrapposto weight on one leg and the other knee slightly bent. The view, this is actually on top of, in an exhibition on top of Prospect Mountain, overlooking Lake George. Fabulous, a fabulous site for a piece of sculpture to frame a view. I was invited to set it up at MoMA in New York, and you can see the Matisse backs in the background. And so I took a picture of it while it was there. The trustees decided not to buy it, but at least I got the picture of it. And you can see here more clearly how it's actually articulated and what those notches are doing. Now, when I came over here, I found, and this was actually, I was teaching for a while in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I was working in a space that I couldn't actually weld in, and so I wanted to kind of try out some ideas, and before building the piece, and so I just started to draw directly on the wall, and then decided maybe I should draw on paper or on boards. So I developed this way of, this is an ambitious piece. It was about 20 feet long, and it required, and I actually built it in plywood before building it in steel, so that I worked out the articulation of it and the proportions and so on in some detail before building it. Initially made it in steel, in a kind of laminated steel, like steel plywood, and then made a second version of it cast in aluminum, and this is the aluminum cast. So it's the same kind of thing. This is an actual arc of a circle, but the way in which it's articulated with these straight elements inside it tends to, when you see it, maybe we've got another view, each one of the straight elements inside it actually tend to look as though they're curved in the opposite direction. So there's the major curve going this way, and then each one of the straight elements inside tends to look as though it's curving slightly the other way. And behind there's one of the wood sculptures that I was doing. I'll show you another piece of that. I was building pieces that, when I first came to New York, I wanted each piece to have completely its own character. And but they were all playing on the idea of how your perception of the piece relates to your knowledge of it. And so you can measure it to be one thing, and then you look at it and it's different. And playing with that, in this case with perspective, so that all this in the same way, this is the main ellipse of this piece is all in the single plane. All the bars crossing it are set at the same angle. They're all the same length, but they're not spaced equally around the perimeter of the ellipse. And the effect, when you stand opposite it, you can probably see its articulation better there. When you stand opposite to it, the effect is that of a terrifically accelerated perspective. You feel as though your vision is being kind of sucked into the empty center of this piece. I'm not showing these in chronological order, but kind of taking themes, and that theme of the arc, and then the ellipse and then this circular piece, which I found, this has 13 bars going across it. I think it's 13 or 14 feet in diameter. One is in collection in Miami, and the other is apparently in downtown Atlanta, but I haven't seen it there. These bars are actually moving across it, starting from at the base. As each one comes up, it moves a little bit further, so that what is maximum extension on your left, by the time it gets to the top, is on your right. I found a circle was a much harder problem to try to articulate it, because although whenever you see the circle from any other place than directly in front of it, it is actually, you always see it as an ellipse. This picture is taken on the Mall in Washington. There was the International Sculpture Conference met in Washington in, I think it was 1980. There was a bunch of sculptures, actually not on the Mall, but adjacent to the Mall. And this is, I got this spot here, which was really nice. So I was making these wood pieces at the same time, and obviously the wood is much less sort of constructive material than steel. But on the other hand, it's got a kind of texture and volume, a kind of sense of touch that, that steel I was finding gave me less and less of. So there's also a degree of volume to it. I made a bunch of these kind of alternating during this period, kind of late 70s, early 80s, between steel and wood sculptures. And doing the same things, this is like with the angel sculpture, working with this sense of what happens at the corners and the sense of a kind of twist in one sense of the piece, and what's joining what where. And this was the biggest piece. This actually now belongs to the Museum of Modern Art in New York and was on show there 2 or 3 years ago for quite a long period of time. You see, I'm again sort of doing this kind of laminating of big lumps of chunks of timber, so that to build a kind of plane. I made a number of these pieces based on this kind of right triangle on its side. This piece is called The House of the Hangman, after a painting by Cézanne. Here's another view of it, and you can see the construction of it better there. It's quite a height. I mean, it's sort of about 9 feet high or so, and about 16 feet across. Now, this is a piece that I made before leaving England, and of course this is not in the plane, but taking this motif and kind of flattening it out, I got a form like this. This is actually this piece is called Building a Wall in the Air, and it's built of separate sections that look as though they're kind of balanced on one another, and as if it would sort of hold together magically. Actually, it's sort of welded or bolted. But here you can see a side view of this, so you can better see the construction of it. Coming back to this idea of making a kind of frame for a standing person. So, and it's as though these projections are kind of really activating the internal space and making a space that's actually quite dangerous. I think I increasingly felt that this manipulating these kind of linear and planar frames, kind of visual frames, was getting less satisfying, and I wanted to do something with to actually see what happened if I would turn it into a volume. So I kind of pretended that to treat the previous piece as a mold and then pour plaster into it. But this is actually a plywood construction. The notches are doing the same kind of thing. I mean, I think the volume is pretty much inert, and it's just flat, kind of flat box-like structure. But what the notches around the outside do is I hadn't really noticed this before, but it's like the volume is kind of made kind of fluid by the way that the notches bite into it, and that they don't seem to match up, and so the actual plane of the front plane of the piece is kind of twisted in the same sort of way. And at the same time also I was just wanted to get back to sort of feeling what volume was like, and so I went right back to some of the earliest pieces that I'd made in the early 60s and kind of made a series of smooth volumetric shapes that were also, you can see it's got this squeeze shape in the middle, that was also another variation on that same shape of the two previous sculptures. So I was kind of tiptoeing towards volume. I had this really magnificent space in Brooklyn, and the work was getting larger and larger and more ambitious. I was building things. I mean, the ceiling here is 20 feet high, so it was actually this piece was actually built of kind of, I guess the internal frame was made of 2x4s, and the outside, I think it was just covered with cardboard. And I was working out the same kind of theme, like building around the outside of the last piece. But I also wanted to get, more of a sense of a kind of activity on the surface, and feeling that it wasn't a constructed volume like a box type of structure, but that it was actually modeled all the way through. So my first attempts at that were, this is pictures taken at the corner of 60th Street and 5th Avenue, where they have a piece of sculpture on view there, I think in about 83 or so. And so this was a kind of first attempt at modeling, but it was really modeled over an internal kind of box-like structure, and I wasn't too happy with that. I mean, I thought it looked okay there, but I wasn't really happy with it. And what happened in the end, I destroyed this, but I still felt attached to this theme and wanted to find a permanent place for it. In the 90s, kind of middle 90s, there was a competition. Artists were sent brochures about asking for submissions for sculpture to commemorate the disappeared in Argentina during the Dirty War in the was it late 70s, early 80s, and this seemed to be an opportunity to try to get this piece made permanently. But actually, I redesigned it. I kept the proportions generally, but I went back to just a plywood form, so that the surface is pretty much that of the plywood, but it's bigger. It's now about 25 feet high, and that's in a sculpture park outside of it's in Buenos Aires. That's the only piece of sculpture on a traditional memorial, and I was very, very happy to do it. In about 82 or so, my wife and I moved out of New York and to a place a couple of hours north of the city, northwest actually. And these pieces that I've been building in Brooklyn were so big that they would necessarily have to go outdoors if they were commissioned. So I thought I would kind of find somewhere to work outdoors, which is what I did. But the first winter I was there, I spent making small models of the pieces that I planned to do in the spring. And the way I did this was to basically make a clay slab and then kind of cut out the forms of the sculptures that I intended to make and poured plaster into that cavity. And these are some of the shapes that I made. The one right in the center is the one I picked on to enlarge and build when the spring came around, and because I was working in a very small space there during that winter. This was a drawing that I made of it. But so I built this thing about 12 feet high, and it was much, it was much more freely modeled than anything I'd done so far. And what I found when I finished it, as I thought, and I didn't really like it at all, because the quality of the modeling seemed to be a kind of in conflict with the drawing of the outside of the piece. And so I kind of cut it in sections, and I was going to take it to the dump. When left it around, the separate sections, I began to look at them, and this is one of those sections. I found that this had a kind of presence that was completely different. It addressed you. It's a kind of probably 6'6", 7 foot high, and it addressed you in a completely different sort of way to the sculpture that I had been making. And without looking like a figure, it had the kind of presence of a figure. And this is the other side of it that I added this little projection to. About this time, I had a dealer in Italy who invited my wife and I to come out there and had a show in Rome. When we were there was the first exhibition of these two wonderful sculptures that had been found on the seabed in between Sicily and Italy, and they're called the Riace bronzes. A Roman general had probably taken them as booty back to Rome, and his ship had been wrecked, and the contents were kind of buried in sand on the sea floor. So a scuba diver had found them, and they had been restored. This must have been about 83 or 4, and they'd been restored for 10 years, like everything takes at least 10 years to be restored in Italy. There were no pictures of them beforehand. We saw them in the Archaeological Museum in Florence, and these two, there's only a picture of one of them here, but these two figures just had a kind of, they were really dramatically presented in a kind of two pools of light standing on a kind of sand or pebble stage, and the kind of, so many people wanted to see them, and it was just amazing. And they're so vital, they're so alive, and even kind of savage looking. They've never been exhibited in this country, and I don't think they've even been exhibited outside the little museum in the south of Italy. But if you ever get a chance, you should really go see these. They're amazing. You can see he was carrying a shield on his left arm and probably holding a sword or spear with his right hand. The details are amazing. The eyes are stone, inset with stone. The lips and nipples are copper, pure copper. The mouth is slightly parted, and the teeth are silver. And they just have a presence that is really electric. They're amazing. And they really made me think about the whole thing of making figures. And so it gave me the confidence, really, to kind of go on doing what I was doing without kind of relying on the sort of geometry and perception and all that kind of slightly conceptual approach, and try to get to something much more physical. So this was one of, after those first two that I made, I made 4 or 5 more, and they became progressively less kind of slab-like and more modeled and less static, and started to have a kind of motion about them. And 1984 was the year of the Los Angeles Olympics, and I remember watching the gymnasts especially, and how in the gymnastics, when the gymnast is kind of on the parallel bars or on those rings, how the body becomes like 2 parts, just the torso, head, and arms become one part, and the legs the other. So I made this group of pieces that didn't just kind of sit on the ground in the kind of the way that the first group of pieces I'd made, and started to become much more active. This piece is actually at the Yale Museum now, University Museum. And this is the first of the series, and there were three. This is the second. And a cast of this is at MoMA in New York. This picture's taken at Yorkshire Sculpture Park, where I had a show, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. So it's the same kind of V shape that's kind of put through a series of rotations. And also, this was a show at the Newmarket. They also became progressively more modeled and more that, the surface became more of a, moving, less of a kind of elaboration of a rectangular slab, and more something that was actually shaped. The next move, I thought, was to kind of get away from this feeling of it being drawn, something sort of frontally drawn, and more into something that would really be conceived completely in the round, so that it didn't have a front or a back or like any especially good views. I mean, it was thought, and if you were to cut a section through this, it would be elliptical or round even, rather than rectangular. So I made this, and I started with these pieces without drawing, and just starting with tiny little clay models that I held in my hand while I was modeling these pieces. And these are quite big too. They're sort of 7 feet high, kind of over life size, certainly over life volume. These pieces are all originally made in the way in which I still work, that they're underneath their plaster and burlap, and then built up with a material called Structolite, which is a kind of plaster with a lightweight aggregate in it, so it's much lighter than plaster. It feels more like cement, but it's obviously much lighter than cement, and you've got a longer drying time, so that it's in a way it's like modeling with clay, but much more. You've got about half an hour to work it. You can really kind of shape it with your hands, and this sense of bringing the form into reality, with rather than kind of conceiving it first, but really the shape comes into existence through your hands, through your body, and it starts to have that much more of a kind of physical body-like relationship to it. And these 5 sculptures, this picture was taken at the Tate Gallery in London in the late 80s. The one on the left and the one in the center are the 2 that I just showed you. And I call these pieces after the earliest, the Greek gods before the Olympian gods, the earliest gods. It's kind of a statement about a kind of continuity with the Greeks, but kind of going back right to the beginnings of that tradition. The first, image of the god that the Greeks worshipped was a meteorite.
Can these be cast from the structuralite into metal?
Yes.
So you can go right from
No, you have to mold it.
You mold it.
Yeah, and then cast it. These pictures were taken at Storm King in '87, and I was fortunate enough to get to be invited to. I sent pictures of a model, but I was invited to build a piece for the Scripps Clinic in La Jolla in California, and I had pretty much once they'd chosen the image, I had pretty much of a free hand to do it. So this was really the biggest thing. I guess it's the tallest pieces that I ever modeled directly in myself. And it was very important. At this time, sort of late 80s, I mean, during the 70s and 80s, there was more and more kind of impersonally fabricated public sculpture around. And I wanted to make things that would be public in their scale, but not kind of made in a factory, but make a point about it actually being made by hand. So these are different views of this same piece.
And these are bronze?
No, this is the plaster. It was being cast at the foundry at Talix nearby, but this is the original plaster. So the finish of it is graphite, which they used as a separator during the sand casting process. So it stood up to the weather. I mean, it's during the summer, I guess, of '87, and it kind of just about lasted through the summer. What I've done, in some cases I left the Structuralite, in other cases I've finished it with a skim coat of plaster, of regular plaster to kind of, Structuralite has a very kind of rough, grainy kind of quality to it. So I like to kind of go over it to kind of unify the surface and to draw attention to the big shapes rather than having your eye distracted by the little kind of unevennesses on the surface.
So these pieces are not the permanent pieces?
No, this is the model.
These are the models?
This got destroyed in the end.
And when do they get cast?
It had been cast.
Okay.
It had been molded, and at the same time as this piece was being shown,
I see.
okay, it was being cast in bronze at the foundry. Okay. After that group of pieces, I wanted to do something that I don't know. I mean, the way I was working was trying to find something to get me going that wasn't a drawing. So I would kind of pick out little fragments of plaster from the studio floor. I mean, at this time I was kind of using an axe to work with when the plaster was set, and there was lots of fragments of plaster all over the place, and I would sometimes pick those out and whittle away at them or dip them in wet plaster, and little tiny things, an inch or two high, and so I kind of accumulated about a dozen of these pieces that I really liked, and so I started to make drawings from them. From those drawings, decided which ones I wanted to make on a larger scale, and this was one of the first of those to come about from this kind of process. This is one of the drawings, and what I found that happened when I was making these drawings, the drawings themselves really became more and more suggestive of figure, specifically of the torso. And actually the drawings are much more, that I made during the 90s are really much more figurative than the sculptures themselves. But it was, about this time I realized that I was actually making figures, not in the sense of complete figures, but certainly during this time as torsos. And this was another that had started in that way and this piece was actually, I have another view of this piece. Yeah, this piece was is in the collection of MoMA in New York too, and they occasionally put it out in the sculpture garden. So you could see that the sort of suggestiveness of a female torso in this piece, and during the I got another commission. I've had actually very few. The few commissions that I've had, and this one is an exception, have really had the the people who live in the place where the sculpture is don't have the same enthusiasm for it as the people who commissioned it. And the one in La Jolla, which was right in front of the hospital, has now been, I guess the director of the hospital was replaced, and the new guy really hated the sculpture, so he arranged to have it moved away from the center of the hospital and tried to make it as inconspicuous as possible. But it's, so you don't see it when you first go there, but actually it's in I think a better place, a more private kind of place, and I'm happier with it there. But this piece was commissioned for the city of Bilbao in Spain, and fortunately before Spain's present financial troubles, it was commissioned at about 95 and was installed around 2000 in bronze. So these are three views of this piece, and this is probably the most massive piece in terms of its volume it's about 11 feet high and 8 or 9 feet across. And it again changes a lot according to what side of it you're seeing. This is outside of my studio in Woodstock, New York, where we were living before making the move to this area. So I think of this as being a female torso. Most of these torsos that I was making during this period of time were one of the most recent of those. This one I actually I made this here, and it is kind of much more literally a female torso. The piece is called Pomona. But when we first moved here, and I didn't have a studio, I rented a little space in the artist building in Leverett, and I just had a small room there, and I brought a big chunk of that had fallen off one of the big sculptures I've been working on, and it seemed to me to resemble Rodin's famous Mask of the Man with the Broken Nose, and I thought I would just like to make some drawings from it, and decided to spend the year making drawings and in a space that didn't have any of the old work around me. And so what happened was that I started to draw from this piece, and I thought, well, you know, I should change it to give it more of the kind of character that I wanted. So I started to work on the plaster and change it, and then make more drawings, and so it went on. Then I thought, well, I'll make another piece and another, and so on. So in the end, I made these kind of imaginary portraits, people I remembered, or figures from art or from literature. And this one was actually of an old friend of mine, one of those American students who'd been at the Ruskin School in the 50s, and his name was Elmore Morgan. He's a really remarkable guy and a really good painter, and lived in Louisiana, and unfortunately he died a couple of years ago. But anyhow, this was a portrait of him as I remembered, and then so I made maybe a dozen of these pieces, and then decided to make them. When I got a studio built here in Ashfield, I started to make some of them, 2 or 3 of them, on a larger scale. And this is another of the smaller, of the small heads. This one I called A Poet for Our Time, and it's kind of, in a way, I was thinking of there's a painting by Philip Guston of T.S. Eliot on his deathbed, and I was thinking of that. So then I made it on a larger scale, kind of changed its character. And by this time I was reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez a lot, and there's a wonderful kind of semi-historical book of his called The General and His Labyrinth, and I got fascinated with his portrait of Simon Bolivar, and so this piece is called The Hero at Evening. It's a kind of tribute to that book and to the hero of that story. And this is an enlarged version of the second small image that I showed you, second portrait image. And this one I called Emperor. And when I was a student at Oxford, there's this Wren building called the Clarendon Theater, which has a series of columns. It's kind of, one end of it is kind of round. It's a rectangular building with a kind of rounded end on it. And then around this are a series of columns, and on top of the columns were heads of emperors. When I was there, they were all kind of crumbling and eroded, and there's kind of some feeling of that in these here. The most recent bunch of images that I'm going to show you are actually based on images of the human hand, and this became, I began to think not only about really making sculpture by hand, but also making an image of the hand as a, as a kind of, on a scale that is kind of equal to that of the human figure. So you kind of relate to it as being a figure in itself, but it's kind of about the act of making sculpture. The first one, they're all pretty much this image of a loosely closed fist, and but in different orientations to the ground. This one I called Night. This is a kind of a nod to Michelangelo's Night, the sculpture in the Medici Chapel. This is called The Void, and this is also a tribute to Giacometti and his sculpture Hands Holding the Void. This again is the same image, but this is this one I thought had a feeling of I was looking at Goya's etchings of the bullfight, and this had a sense, although it's originally it's a hand image, but it also was suggestive to me of the kind of a charging bull. And I've been doing a bunch of prints recently. A number of those are also based on images of the hand. And this is the most recent I don't know if it'll be the last, but it's the most recent of that series. And that's all I have to show you tonight.
I have a question, because I'm interested in technical things. Is there a reason why some of the things that are exhibited look like they're with the plaster, which, if I get it right, that is not necessarily the finished piece, and then others that are the bronze?
Well, the reason is that my gallery in New York, the freight elevator is not big enough to accommodate a sculpture in bronze. I mean, of any size. So mostly when they're in plaster. Sometimes they're in plaster because I can't afford to cast them. But more often they're in plaster because I bring them in sections into the gallery and then reassemble them.
What gallery is it?
McKee.
Can you talk a little bit more about scale with not necessarily the hands, but the previous work, referencing the figure? How does that relate to sort of the viewer? I mean, is that sort of, Are you thinking of the viewer when you're working?
Well, they're big, and mostly, and yeah, I mean they're meant to be not intimidating, but substantially larger than life, and the pieces that I've had the most problem with have probably been, sort of pieces about this size, which in fact are probably literally about life size, in terms of the volume of the human figure and the volume of, and so that kind of, I don't mind, I find it good to work on pieces that are like hand size or smaller, or pieces that are much bigger than I am, but they're kind of, that sort of intermediate size I find really frustrating, and I think it's something to do with the fact that it's, I don't know, I mean, to work much larger or smaller I find really liberating, and working at that scale is somehow inhibiting.
Do you design work for a specific environment, or do you consider that when you're designing a piece?
No.
So you focus on the piece and it goes
Yeah.
where it goes.
Yeah.
But the pieces in the Tate Gallery, it looked like you'd figured it all out way in advance, but
No.
they
No.
just belong.
They work. That central kind of hall area that goes out is a really nice place too. It's hard to go wrong there.
So looking at that image that's up there now, did you know you were going to make something that looked like that before you started? In other words, you had an armature of such, but did you add onto it as you were going and
Well,
make it a different shape, or did this start
when
out?
I started to work in this way with Structuralite and plaster, I had a pretty rigid armature. Like those first pieces, they had wood and chicken wire and all kinds of stuff. But over the years, I've developed a way of working. I know in general what I'm going to do because I'm working from a small model. But so what I do is kind of divide this model in half, and then kind of slice it down the middle, and then on the floor build a kind of a form out of some flexible material. And more recently I've been using straw. And so roughly shape it on the ground, and then put like saran wrap or something over that, and then make a plaster and burlap mold of it, really. And then pick that up and do the other side, and then put the two halves together. And so then you've got a really rigid, basic shape, but it's empty inside. So it's really light and strong. And so then, I can build up on top of that, or equally cut into it, and or take out sections and move them around and that kind of thing. So you have a lot of flexibility.
And it changes from your model, from the beginning model.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think enlarging is something that, again, is something that becomes very kind of, sort of routine, kind of sculptural procedure. And foundries these days kind of, I mean, they can do amazing things with cameras, a camera that kind of takes pictures, and it kind of takes a whole bunch of points, so it can reproduce something in whatever scale you want out of styrofoam or some stuff like that. And it's really, I mean, that's the fun of it for me, is seeing what happens as it gets, as it goes from something being this size to something being much larger than I am.
Do you feel more liberated now that instead of using the welder or using a saw, that now they're actually physically working with their hands and getting...
Yeah, but well, also I've discovered the saw. The saw is about the only tool, like mechanical, electrical tool that I use on a regular basis, because an axe does terrible damage to the to the actual fabric of the plaster. But you cut into it with a sawzall, and it cuts pretty good, you know. So that is quite liberating. So you can move around big chunks on the surface, or you can push it in, add it, you know.
The graphite surface, what is that you described?
Well, that was just used to separate, so that when they made a sand mold of that particular sculpture, they rubbed graphite on the surface so that it wouldn't stick. It just made a really nice looking, kind of, finish, patina really, for the plaster.
Some of your sculptures to me look like you got the distance and hurled some of the material at it and then worked it, but...
Yeah, I do that. Yeah. That's liberating.
Say something more about you're moving more towards the figure.
At that time, the pieces I were making were just kind of were like sort of vertical slabs, so I thought they had a figurative presence. But as I've got more into shaping, they've become not like, I've never made a complete figure, but parts of figures. So it remains quite abstract. And things like the horses' heads that I showed you to start with, they're kind of sort of like horses' heads, but they're also like other things too. And so I want the image to remain open and not to be so literal that you immediately, you get fixated on the image and is it like a horse's head or whatever, and not for you not to worry about that.
I wonder about, I assume a few of these are on pallets or on wooden structures. It seems like in a gallery setting, there is a plinth there that is not unlike a pallet, and I wonder...
Well, I build pallets just to move them around. But, and so also in the gallery, I move them around in the gallery. But, when if they get cast and permanently located anywhere, I'm not happy with the idea of a kind of a concrete slab or something they sit on. I'd like to be able to shape the ground somehow so they, are kind of organically related to the ground they're sitting on.
Yeah, there seemed to be a formal decision in my mind with regards to the sort of the plasticity of the material itself, which is, looking at the trajectory of more geometric abstraction of your earlier work and where you are now, the hand is more and more evident, and then maybe that relation. I don't know. I saw the plinth as sort of being a little bit of a remnant of your past, maybe, and geometry.
but the plinth or pedestal was like the kind of an absolute no-no. So we wanted to get rid of the plinth completely, and it should be directly on the ground and be as much part of the space as a chair, or a table, that was the idea.
Was that a reasonable idea?
Was a reasonable idea. It was an exciting idea at the time because there was a whole bunch of figures on plinths. But there is a reason for it, which is, when something is rests directly on the ground, as you move away from it, you get to any distance, you can't see the thing because you need to have it elevated to see it from a distance. It's quite a practical thing.
I was fascinated by what you said about the first sort of godlike thing people worship was a meteorite.
Mm-hmm.
Is that in a history book? Or? Is that just something you imagined, or?
No, it's not something I imagined.
Sorry.
That's true. It's true. It's the David Friedberg, I think. He's the author of a book called The Power of Images. Have you come across that? And he talks about that.
Can I ask you how important color is to you with form, or, I mean, if you do something in bronze, you have an array of colors.
Mhm.
Is that an important part for you, or not as important?
Oh, well, I don't sort of think about in advance, but you can really get some fabulous color, and you know, bronze changes over time anyhow, you know, so that it's great what happens to it.
As a student, you moved away from what was contemporary at the time, or what Henry Moore was doing in the figure, and that just how you, as a teacher now, and as a teacher for 30 plus years, and department head, how you talk to your students about contemporary sculpture, or about moving away from the trends, or sticking with the trends, or I mean, an issue
Well,
that
I
is-
resigned for that reason. Well, no, I mean I mean the kind of there are. I find it there are very few places now, schools, that you know I feel that I can connect with what is going on, because it's so conceptual and so little to do with looking and with handling material. It gets to be a problem.
Are you no longer connected to Bard anymore? Or?
I know I haven't taught there for 5 years,
You haven't taught there in 5 years.
or maybe
Is that
more.
Why you moved up to Western?
Well, I had to leave Bard because it's such a long way. So spend as much time commuting as teaching. It got to be a drag.
But do you feel like it's gotten drastically different compared to when you were teaching in Nova Scotia or teaching?
Yeah, everything has changed.
Yeah.
Everything has really changed since I moved to the U.S. And I felt there was a lot of interest and sympathy in the early '80s. You know, with the neo-expressionist painters, there was interest in imagery and in a kind of much more physical kind of painting, and so I definitely felt an affinity with what was going on, but less so. I mean, there are places where painting still goes on, you know, but there are very few that in the kind of way in which I'm describing. But not many places. I mean, the New York Studio School is the only place I can think of where in sculpture, and of course in painting too.
You've talked wonderfully about the sculpture, and you've really said very little about how you got there, the process, the thinking process. But I keep thinking the physical process of getting these pieces together is just awesome to me. Like just doing them, and you've talked very little about that. I mean, it's.
Well, I mean, I could talk about, you know, the kind of process of doing it, but
I'm not making that.
I'm not, you know, I mean, I don't kind of think about that consciously too much, you know. I mean, it's what I like to do, and I'm fortunate up till this point to be able to be paid for it, but who knows?
Wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being such an interested audience.